So thanks everyone for joining. Like I said, this is our fifth case studies in neurocritical care AI web series. Um, I want to just recap a couple of things before, and then I'll turn the floor over to Alex. Why are we doing this? Um, the company has for decades had a mission of trying to enable clinicians to take better care of patients and how to better understand brain injury and how to better manage guidance. Dick's first companies were involved in the integration of devices. The new company, going on now for a few years, has been how do we integrate data? And so how do we take the next step and close that loop from collecting all this amazing data to wrapping around and doing the analytics necessary and getting that data back into the hands of the people taking care of the patients in the best way possible and enabling new technologies and new methods to help us better understand the injury. And so that's our reason for being here at Moberg. And so why we're doing these webinars is to help close that loop. And there are people out there are doing amazing things. And if we can help, teach people a little bit every week or every month, it's a good thing. So thanks very much. I just think I will skip this slide because I just covered it. I'm not watching my slides. If you would like to give feedback on the webinar, please scan this QR code. We have a Google survey up there and would love to hear back from you on how to make this more useful. This is we're the reason we're doing this. So please take some time and give us some feedback if you'd like. Thanks. The first, you can always go back and review previous webinars at the link posted there. The first sessions were Ed Kim's introduction. We had Dr. Rowan Diaz-Aristia come on and talk about ICP and PB202 burden and visualization and prediction. And last month we had Ethan talking about more predictions with Boost 2. The dates for 2024, they're the third Friday of every month, so you'll see the dates there. So look for calendar invites for those. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website. So this month, we are honored to have Dr. Alex Vaz. He is a second-year neurosurgery resident at Penn, studying under Dmitriy Petrov, another good friend of the company. Alex brings an engineering background and an interest in brain electrophysiology to his neurosurgical practice and to his research. Today, he's going to be discussing his work on how the return of intracranial beta oscillations and traveling waves are related to recovery from TBI. He's done a lot of really cool, interesting work on how those two can be predictive. So with that, Alex, I will express my gratitude and turn it over to you and stop sharing.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. Let's see. Okay, let me just try to pull up my slides here. Okay, sounds good. Cool. Yeah, thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. Yeah, so I'm a second-year neurosurgery resident at Penn. I've been kind of tangentially involved with the Moberg group as one of the interns last year who was basically placing a lot of these electrodes and multimodality monitors in our TBI patients. And so, I've been kind of headfirst engrossed in this world for about 2 years now. And, as part of Penn's standard of care, we place these quad lumen bolts that give us, like you mentioned before, PBTO2 and ICPs, and also we place electrodes and we get some physiological data like lactate to pyruvate ratio. And so the Moberg group is really in a nice place because these are all very complicated data streams that we as clinicians are trying to interpret. But what makes it very difficult, obviously, is that, it's not really clear what all these different streams of information mean. And with those different streams of information, we have to try to make very complicated and, very important decisions for patients, often at their ends of life, or just for prognostication purposes in general. So you can see why we as clinicians need smart guys like yourself to help us figure these things out. So on that note, my background, I did my thesis work in cognitive neuroscience and computational neuroscience, mostly with biological spiking networks, and so I'm sort of interested in the AI space as well. But with that engineering background, I studied very heavily in spectral processing and trying to figure out what the actual electrical signals from the brain actually mean. So to that effect, when we had our TBI patients implanted with these electrodes, both depth and strip electrodes, I started taking a look at the actual electrical signatures from the brains of these patients and tried to basically predict, are there actual features of these signals that inform recovery from traumatic brain injury? And so that's kind of the long-winded opening for why I'm interested in this and why this matters, and why it's really important for us as clinicians as well. So again, this is meant to be super informal talk. At any point, if you need me to stop, or if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. So but basically, you guys probably already know this very well, traumatic brain injury, it can be viewed as a local phenomenon, but really, I think what we're starting to understand more and more is that it's a network level dysfunction. So these are just different kind of pictures showing you from the single neuron level to more of a network level perspective, how traumatic brain injury can cause disruption in the networks that lead to consciousness, cognition, memory, learning, emotions, etc. And so really, the evolution of understanding of TBI has gone from, someone hitting their head to how is the brain-wide connectivity disrupted, and how is the thalamus talking to the cortex, and how is the hippocampus talking to deeper brain structures, and how can we actually interpret these networks and make some sense of it. And so again, from my background, and forgive the picture, but it's just a nice illustration, just showing that different parts of the brain organize together to form different what are called oscillatory activities, or different types of brain waves, if you will. And so you can see a couple different types here. One is a slow oscillation, one's called a spindle, and that's more kind of in the beta frequency range. And then the ripples are these very fast frequency oscillations, kind of around the 100 hertz. So these are kind of a good analogy is really back in the 40s, we didn't really understand how the heart worked, but people started plugging up electrodes to the chest and getting different signals, and then they weren't really clear what it meant at the time. But over the years, we have a very good lexicon for understanding what the signals from the heart actually mean now, and we actually can treat based on what the EKG shows, and we have a very good not only a diagnostic, but also therapeutic potential based on what the EKG looks like. So I think now we're at the point where we can strap electrodes to the brain and we can kind of get analogous signals from the brain, but we're still in kind of the infancy of really understanding what these signals mean. But the long-term goal and the long-term possibility being that we might have really exciting diagnostic and therapeutic strategies that come from understanding these signals. So carrying it forward then, so TBI might cause network level disruptions, and then those disruptions might be reflected in these different brain waves, or these brain oscillations that we might be able to measure. How this might look is something like this. So This type of plot in the middle here is called a power spectral density. It's really just, kind of a fancy way of saying what frequency bands actually compose your signal. Okay, so for example, in an orchestra, you have the tenors and the bass, and you have people singing at different frequencies, and those all kind of compose the final picture that you see at the end, or the final sound. Likewise, in the brain, there's a lot of different frequency oscillations. So some that you see here, some around 1 hertz, some are 20 to 30 hertz, some are 9 to 12 hertz. And so what people started to measure maybe in the last 20, 30 years is that if you have electrodes on the scalp, you can kind of see, especially in that 20 to 30 hertz range, that this signal corresponds very well to the level of awareness, or the level of consciousness of these patients who experience traumatic brain injury. So here, just going through those abbreviations on the right, so vegetative state, minimally conscious, confused, and normal. You see, as people become more aware, more normal, you get this emergence of these beta oscillations, which have been proposed to be reflecting thalamocortical activity. So the whole background then of what I'm going to tell you about today is that traumatic brain injury causes network level dysfunction that looks like, at least preliminarily, you can find different frequency bands that reflect this dysfunction, and you might be able to use that to decode something about how the patient's going to do. So bringing this back over to what I've done recently is over at Penn. Again, we have two separate patient groups. So patients that present with acute subdural hemorrhages from blunt force trauma, usually falls, but we also have a lot of patients who have car accidents or gunshots to the head and things like that as well. So this is an example of a patient who had a subdural hemorrhage that was evacuated with a craniotomy, meaning a hole in the skull. And then you can see there are these contacts. These are eight contacts of a strip electrode that was left in place intraoperatively. And postoperatively, this patient went to the ICU. So this affords us a really nice window into the brain, in that this patient has some level of depressed consciousness. And then we also have electrodes on the brain surface as opposed to on the scalp. And then we can actually measure what's going on with their brain's electrical activity as they recover from coma in the ICU over the next couple of days. So what these signals look like is something like this. So the top signal there is just the raw trace. And so, I don't have to do very much to convince you that there's a highly stereotyped oscillation present in that signal. The bottom trace here is something called a spectrogram. So it's really just another way of looking at this, where on the y-axis you have the relative magnitude of the frequency, and on the x-axis is just time. So basically what this shows, where you have these kind of yellow peaks, is where you have these increased beta frequency power, meaning that kind of 10 to 30 hertz signal. And so what's really interesting is that you can make those same types of plots. So here's that power spectral density. This is kind of just like the average of this plot over here. And if you look at this, you can convince yourself that there's a nice little peak here in that beta frequency range that corresponds to this oscillation that you see here in the raw signal. The different lines are not super important, but these are just different computational ways of confirming that there is a real signal here. So all of this is great, and so that means that we can actually measure these signals in these patients who are post-operative, and we can correlate these signals to their actual comatose state. And so how we do that is with something called a Glasgow coma score, which you might be familiar with, but really boiled down, what it means is that Glasgow coma score of 3 means you're basically completely comatose. And then coma score of 15 means you're completely normal. So within that range, we see all kinds of different things in the pathologies that come into Penn. And so if you just very simply plot the amount of this beta power against this Glasgow coma score, what you can convince yourself is that there's a really nice relationship between the coma state and how much beta power there is. Or in other words, as patients recover from their coma, you see more and more of this beta oscillation existing in their electrical activity on the brain surface. So that by itself was interesting for us, meaning that there was a kind of relatively easy to extract feature from the electrophysiological data that influenced basically, or that correlated very strongly with the coma state of these patients. And so the next part of that is seeing, like, is this metric actually dynamic with time? Meaning, can you see that when patients have a GCS of 10, is their beta power lower within that same patient when they recover back to 15? And so here's an example of that, where this patient came in with an acute subdural hemorrhage. For those of you who haven't seen a CT scan before, this hyperintense area over here, if you can see my mouse, is where the subdural hemorrhage is. And so these are the preoperative scans. On the postoperative scans, you can see that hemorrhage has been evacuated, and postoperatively, a 4-contact strip electrode was left in place. And so what it looks like from left to right. So day 0 is over here on the left, and day 4 is over here on the right. If you just look at the bottom plots here, what you can convince yourself of is that that beta peak that I showed you before actually increases over time. And what's really interesting is you can convince yourself that as the patient goes from GCS 11 to GCS 15, there's a really nice correlation between the amounts of that beta peak and their actual coma state or their coma score. In other words, as this patient recovered back to normal, they had a huge increase in the amount of beta power over these electrodes. And then you can see that in the raw traces in the very top as well. So this is an example from a contact on the brain surface. You can see that beta oscillation isn't very strong or not very present, but then by day 4, you have this very large magnitude concerted beta oscillation that's there in that place. Okay, so that's the patient that did well. The converse is can you show this in a patient that didn't do well? So here's a patient that presented with a left frontal contusion from a blunt force trauma to the head. They underwent a quad lumen bolt placement that you can see here on the post-op radiograph. And through that post-op, through that quad lumen bolt, a depth electrode was placed, and the same sort of analyses were performed. And what you can see here is that this patient ended up dying on post-op day 3, but this patient never recovered that beta oscillatory power within that electrode. So then that paints 2 different pictures here. Is one, you have these patients who are recovering from traumatic brain injury, and you have this evolution of beta oscillatory power in the electrodes on the brain surface. And then you have the converse, which is patients who don't recover their Glasgow coma score. And you also see that they do poorly clinically, but also from electrophysiologically, they're not recovering that beta oscillatory power as well. So that together then means that we have a pretty strong idea that these beta oscillations correspond with consciousness, with recovery from coma, with the cognitive processes that are related to recovery from coma. But this is all great and well, but does this actually inform how these patients do mortality-wise? So just directly quantifying that, we can quantify the amounts of these beta oscillations. And we can show pretty easily that the patients who ended up dying within the hospital had much lower beta oscillatory power than those patients who ended up surviving their injury. Conversely, we can make these Kaplan-Meier type of survival curves. In this case, this is showing the percent remaining in the hospital, so patients who are not discharged. And if you just split these patients into a high beta oscillation group and a low beta oscillation group, so just a simple like median split, you can show that patients who have high beta oscillations are discharged from the hospital much more quickly, meaning that their functional status is much better than the patients who have low beta power and took longer to be discharged from the hospital, and in some cases not discharged at all. And so these results together give us really good information that these patients, the functional status of these patients is actually really closely related to the amount of beta oscillations that happen in their brain. And so carrying this forward, then beta oscillations by themselves are very interesting. And there's quite a bit of literature evidence talking about beta oscillations and cognition and memory, working memory, episodic memory, learning, abstraction, creativity even. And so there's these are really well understood phenomenon, but the other thing is, can you show that these beta oscillations actually integrate multiple brain areas? In other words, if we go back to the very first slide here, when I'm showing you that TBI causes large-scale functional network disruption, can you actually show that these beta oscillations reflect that? Meaning that, can you show that these beta oscillations reflect some network dysfunction or some network dyssynchrony even? So the way that we went about showing that was basically showing that these beta oscillations are actually coordinated across space. So if you think about standing oscillations that are coordinated across space, what that looks like is a traveling wave of activity. So these are two different patients who are both came in with acute subdural hemorrhages, one from a car accident, one from a fall. And again, this same paradigm where we have the electrodes implanted on the brain surface. The top one has 4 contacts, the bottom one has 6 contacts. And you can show basically in the beta frequency range from electrodes 1 to 4 in the top that there's this slight offset in the oscillatory phase from contact 1 to contact 4. And it's actually a rhythmic offset where you can show that these waves are actually traveling across space from electrodes 1 to 4. And you can plot the actual phase of those using simple time frequency metrics on the bottom plot there. Likewise, for that patient on the bottom, there's 6 contacts. And you can show the same thing where you have this traveling oscillation that's actually moving across electrodes in space, and you can show these things pretty robustly for the electrodes that are sitting on the brain surface. And so this again is just to show that these oscillations aren't just kind of static in space, but they're actually coordinating multiple brain regions across the length of the strip electrode. And so then the question is, if we have these beta oscillations, they correspond with mortality from discharge from the hospital, and they're now traveling across space, can you do the same type of math and actually show that these beta oscillations are important for GCS, and do they actually relate to these beta oscillations? And so they do. And so the wave rate, meaning how many of these waves you can detect over time, is also related pretty strongly to the coma score of these patients, meaning that patients who have more waves are actually higher on the coma scale, meaning that they're more close to being normal. Whereas the patients who are GCS3, meaning completely comatose, have the lowest number of traveling waves across their brain surface. So that again gives very good evidence that these traveling waves are useful in cognition and consciousness as well. And the bottom plot there is showing that the wave rate actually corresponds to the amount of oscillatory power that you see as well, which is also intuitive, meaning that if you have more beta oscillations, you're more likely to have traveling waves as well. And finally, you can do the same type of math where you now say, do these waves actually inform mortality in these patients? And you can show that the patients who died actually had much lower wave rates than the patients who survived. Likewise, in the bottom plot, you can make the same type of Kaplan-Meier curve and show that the wave rates actually influence or correspond to the rate of discharge from the hospital as well. So meaning that the high wave rates were discharged from the hospital much more quickly than the patients who had lower wave rates. So just to summarize the results then is that we're saying that we set out to look for markers of consciousness and markers of recovery from traumatic brain injury. We have this very unique window into brain physiology in terms of the electrodes that we implant in both the quad lumen bolts and also the subdural strip electrodes. We found that beta oscillations tracked the coma score relatively well and informed mortality and discharge from the hospital, but also these beta oscillations form traveling waves across space, and that those also reflected the mortality and the discharge from the hospital as well. So then going forward, the hope is to potentially use beta oscillations and traveling waves as a formal prognostic marker for patients in the hospital, where if you have two different patients who come in with the GCS of 7, you might be able to use these electrophysiological markers to say this patient is more likely to do well than this patient, and then that in turn helps us make a lot of clinical decisions and shared decision making with the family, which is oftentimes very difficult as well. So I'll go ahead and stop there. I'm not sure if I took too little or too long time, but these are all the folks to thank for the work here. My mentors both at Duke and NIH, and also my mentors here at Penn as well. So again, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have regarding any of these things.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. This is really interesting. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A, or if you want to send us a message, you can do that, and we can. There's one coming in. A question. In case you compare these beta waves with the GCS, is there no effect of sedation? So
Yeah.
someone's
So
asking
this
about
is
the effect. Yeah.
yeah, this is a really good question. So in the paper itself, I directly compared this because it was something that's a really big confound for a lot of these analyses. So postoperatively, a lot of these patients will be intubated, and most patients who are intubated will be on either propofol, fentanyl, and sometimes Precedex as well. All of these medications have effects on the level of consciousness, obviously, but there's also documented effects on things like traveling waves and different cortical oscillatory activity as well. So we did a direct linear mixed model analysis to actually see does the level of sedation actually affect the oscillations and the traveling waves more so than the actual coma state itself. And what we found was that the level of sedation actually had a very small effect on the number of waves and the actual amount of oscillatory activity compared to the level of arousal and the actual coma score, that the actual neurological exam that we got from the patient. So that's a really good point, and I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that that wasn't a confound for the analysis, and it looks like for us at least it's a really small effect compared to everything else.
Another question, and that's actually related to something I was wondering. Can you see any of this from scalp electrodes? I was wondering about if there are non-invasive ways to get this data as well.
Yeah, so that's also a good point. So actually, the very first plots here, which are not my data, but these were all collected from the scalp. So they were able to see some of these changes where and for example, in completely vegetative state, you can see that power spectrum is completely flat, whereas in the normal power spectrum, you can see some of these peaks in the theta and the beta range as well. So it is possible to do some of these things with scalp electrodes, definitely. But the level of signal to noise resolution that you get with the intracranial electrodes is definitely much, much higher. And that increased resolution is definitely necessary to measure things like traveling waves as well.
Right. It's interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting on this. I found this topic extremely interesting. Just to put the scope of your work kind of in the series, the theme of the series, I think this is a really good example of how AI applications can range in complexity. Usually as they become more complex, they're harder to explain. The clinical relevance of your work is elegantly simple, allowing you to explore kind of the clinical meaning behind it. So I just want to commend you for that. Sometimes the most elegant solutions are often the simplest ones. So this is one um, that is pretty easy to explain from a clinical perspective. Um,
Sure.
I I can't help but notice, but when you were looking at the wave rate, what you're exploring is eerily similar to spreading depolarizations. And as someone who's been studying that for a while, I can't help but ask for comments on that from you in terms of how that might be mechanistically related, and whether that's just something that is underlyingly the same between uh, signals recorded through like a cortical strip like that.
Yeah, no, so it's a really good point. And actually, the next paper I'm hoping to write will be on the interaction between spreading depolarizations and these phenomena actually. So it's a really apropos point. The so really how I think about these things is in this data as well. So I'm kind of coming from the perspective where these beta oscillations, the traveling waves, these are all part of normal physiology, meaning that in you and me and healthy people, we need these things to actually do cognition and motor and sensor motor functions and etc. Uh, in our TBI patients, what I also see along with a lot of these phenomena are seizures, number one, but also we see spreading depolarizations in these data as well. And so on one hand, you have these healthy oscillations that you and me and these TBI patients need for recovery from consciousness and also for cognition. But on the other hand, you have this whole spectrum of non-physiological or deleterious activity. On one hand, you have spreading depolarizations. On the other hand, you have actual epilepsy or interictal discharges as well. And so in what I'm showing you here is definitely more of the traveling waves, more of the healthy physiology. The spreading depolarizations itself, which I've started to characterize in this data as well. The wave fronts of those are something on the order of 3 to 5 minutes itself. So for example, these waves are something like 20 to 30 milliseconds, but the actual spreading depolarization it's a much bigger wavefront and a much larger and longer wavefront as well. So at least mechanistically and electrophysiologically, we can tell those two phenomena apart reasonably well. For me, at least preliminarily, for spreading depolarizations, depending on how you quantify them, I can see about maybe 1 per hour in these types of data sets. Obviously, the more sick patients will have a little bit more, and the less sick patients will have a little bit less. And so that's kind of the rate that I see personally from the spreading depolarization. Again, it's just one strip on the brain surface, so there's probably many more that are happening elsewhere that I can't see. Whereas the traveling waves here, what I'm saying something more along the lines of like 8 to 10 hertz, so many times per second. And so although both of these things are kind of existing in tandem, we feel pretty comfortable dissociating them for now. But I think your point is definitely really well said, where there's very exciting questions to be answered in terms of what is the interplay between these things. Uh, Me personally, I think that spreading depolarizations in epilepsy will kind of cancel out or inhibit a lot of this healthy activity that I'm showing you here on the screen. And so that would be a hypothesis for how spreading depolarizations actually contribute to loss of function in the cortex as well.
Cool.
Sorry, so I see one other question here. Have you looked
Yeah.
at the quality of ST? Yeah, so that's also a good point. So the for the waves that I'm showing you here, I did the wave detection on both the cortical strips and the depth electrodes, with the assumption being that traveling waves, normal healthy traveling waves, would be more expected to travel across the cortical surface as opposed to along the depth of the depth electrodes, which are deep within the white matter of the parenchyma. And so what we could show that pretty easily, meaning that the wave rate was higher in the strip electrodes than in the depth electrodes. And then the correspondence between the GCS and the wave rate was much better in the strip electrodes as opposed to the depth electrodes as well. So that was for the traveling wave analysis itself. For the spreading depolarization, I think I haven't showed it yet, but I think that that same relationship should be true, where the cortical strips will be much more sensitive for detecting spreading polarizations, whereas the depth electrodes wouldn't be as good just because the depolarization is basically propagating perpendicular to the axis of the depth electrode itself. So it's obviously not as simple as that, but I think that's generally how I think about these things.
So from our side, we're always interested in the data, right? So, can you describe maybe some of the challenges you had from a data point of view, maybe harmonization or data cleansing, and then how did you get around these? And was that what percentage of time was the data prep versus actually doing the analysis?
Sure. So no, those are insightful things too. Um, I think in the clinical recording regime, there are a lot of things that are a little bit outside of our control. So um, obviously, if the patient needs to go for a scan, or if they need to go for a procedure or need to go back to the operating room or anything like that, the electrical recordings are disconnected so that they can go do all these things, right? So these recordings are a little bit discontinuous in that sense. Um, Secondarily, in this clinical paradigm, these are linear strip electrodes, which are kind of low tech, honestly, compared to a lot of the high density grids that you see in epilepsy surgery or some other types of surgery as well. And so the actual hardware limitations are there as well. Also from the clinical side, for data storage purposes at Penn, all of these signals are sampled at 256 hertz, which is fine for most applications, but if you're interested in the higher frequency signals, say over 100 hertz, then you're pushing relatively close to the Nyquist limit, and that's also pretty limiting as well. So um, those are really the main things. Obviously, line noise issues are always, challenging in this type of data as well. But those are kind of universal things from my perspective. So the main things are really the clinical limitations of acquiring the data, and some of the sampling frequencies are also kind of challenging as well.
Oh, thanks. So what's the next step for you in this research? Is it just really kind of, well, if we could get this, would you try to implement something like this, or just have it help you inform for, decision makings for patients, or where do you imagine going with this?
Yeah, so the next step, research wise, is trying to understand the interplay between this physiology and things like spreading depolarizations and seizures. That's kind of the immediate next step. Um, in a parallel sense, though, if we believe strongly that these things can actually prognosticate recovery from brain injury, then we would want to actually build this into a real-time paradigm where we actually can measure these things in real time and use it to make clinical decisions on the bedside as well. And so, implementing this in real time, it would have some challenges as well, because all of the code for this is basically sitting on my laptop. But I think that's a really valuable goal for the future for us, is being able to actually help patients with this as well. But yes, academically and research wise, we want to start pushing into the effects with the polarizations and seizures, and then also can we link this to a lot of the multimodality data that we collect, and that some of the data that you guys are interested in as well, which is can we link these phenomena to things like intracranial pressure and heart rate and brain metabolism as well.
Be interesting. Maybe even, I mean, you've got Boost 3 going on now. Maybe a subsidiary study of that might be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll make a plug for Ethan, because he probably won't do it for himself. Implementing algorithms, taking the stuff off of your laptop and injecting it into the a more real-time flow of data is kind of precisely what one of the things we're working on. Ethan's doing this with Jed Hardings over at UC, with his spreading depolarization work that they're doing. We're doing some with Brendan Foreman on getting CPP opt at the bedside. So algorithms of different complexity and novelness. Ethan's working on getting those injected into the circle of patient care. So we would really it would be another cool example of trying to do that in real time.
And something I wanted to mention, if you wanted to validate this on another data set, the track TBI data set has some patients with electrocorticography. So you could use that as a validation data set for this. And they have some of these outcome variables in FIPR as well, so that you'd be able to run the analysis, but on an independent data set, just to verify that everything checks out.
Got it. Yeah, no, both of those are good points. We've with the Jed Hardings work we recently opened the Indict trial here at Penn as well. And I think there's that's between us, Cincinnati, and I think UCSF as well, looking specifically for a lot of these spreading depolarizations. So we're definitely excited and involved in all of that as well. And yeah, that's also a good point. The track TBI data set. I would love to see this independently reproduced in other data sets as well. So it's definitely a good point.
Another question from the Q&A. You mentioned microdialysis. Have you been able to compare energy metabolism with beta oscillations?
Yeah, I mean, I have not, but it's a really good point, right? Meaning that the primary one that we look at as neurosurgery clinicians is the pyruvate to lactate ratio, meaning is the brain and actually this catabolic or pro-metabolic state, and can you actually make some inference based on that? My naive assumption would be that there is a relationship, meaning that if you're in this more normal state, you might have a more normalized lactate to pyruvate or more normalized metabolic profile that you can actually measure from the microdialysis. I have no proof for this though, and but it's something that's something that I would naively hypothesize to be true. So it's definitely a good point.
Oh, any more questions? It was really interesting discussion. I love these webinars where we get to look at all this really cool work. It's fascinating, and I admire you guys so much.
Yeah, and I'm thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. Obviously, we're here and we're close by. You guys have my email if you ever have any questions or concerns, or want to talk about things. We're very approachable and obviously very excited about this type of work as well.
Yeah, if there's if there's data or things that are shareable that you don't mind putting out to the audience, we've got an online version of our software running, and the people who are in this webinar series have access to download that data in those notebooks. So that's kind of a good segue here. Everyone, you should have received invitations to get onto that system. You should be able to find the videos and the notebooks and the data from past webinars. So if you would like to get on and try that out, we would love your feedback on how that's going. And then Alex, if there's anything shareable about this, we'd love to add it to the repository.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything on hand with me right now, but all of this data, is we're actively collecting it, and it's obviously open for analysis for all of you guys as well. So I'm happy to put together anything for you.
Oh, that'll be great. Ethan, if there are no more questions, I think Ethan, you wanted to run through a couple things really quick.
Yes. I will start sharing. Like Craig mentioned, you all should have received an email with a link to create an account for this workspace, and you can log in, accept the terms and conditions, navigate to webinars, and these have data from the previous webinars with the Jupyter notebooks and sample data. What I didn't highlight in that newsletter is that you actually have access to review, annotate all of the Boost 2 data. And this data set is pretty simple because we have several measurements, but right now you're looking at ICP on as a trend, and on the right we have a histogram of PPTO2 and ICP measurements, and then simple trace of the ECG. This platform gets more interesting the more complex the data stream is. So here is a sister site for the track TBI data set. I'm in the middle of harmonizing all the data according to what Brandon Foreman has. Just to give you a bit of a teaser on some of the capabilities, we have a waveform review, EEG in the browser. I have histograms, and particularly it's really easy to see trends. So seeing how things change in time by moving left and right. That's one of my favorite things about this. And then some pretty unique displays of things that are synced. And then going back to the topic of spread depolarization, there's a spread depolarization display as well. And Alex, this is what we were mentioning by the integration with Jed's algorithm, being able to deploy Jed's SD algorithm in tangent with our software so that these things could be detected in real time. And we're attempting to do something at UC that would allow us to do that. So just giving a bit of a teaser to what we've been working on internally and how the intersection of our work might help you as well, Alex, with deploying maybe an algorithm to do some detection on that simple metric that you were presenting on. But at least in the interim, everyone should have access to this data set and can explore its features for like annotation review and what have you. And if you have any questions or you need access, you lost the email, just email me at ethan@moberganalytics.com and I'll get you set up. Thank you.
Awesome. So we don't have an agreement to distribute the data. So if someone wanted to actually do something with the data, we'd probably have to come up with some data use agreements between yourselves and the studies. But I think that's probably doable based on our experience. Awesome. So if there are no more questions, I will thank you all again very much for joining, especially our European friends who are again placing us in between the end of their day and a beverage. So we thank you very much. And as always, the recordings will be available and posted on the website and on the Connect site, both of those. So you'll have access to all that stuff. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll end it here. And again, Alex, thank you so much for agreeing to come on and share this fantastic work with us. We look forward to working
Thank
with
you
you.
guys so much. Really appreciate it.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.